Good morning, Liana. Good morning, Emily. My name is Irina Ellison. I'm the moderator for this session this morning. So I'm going to go ahead and make you both I don't know if I can make you co-hosts. Let me just check real quick. Oh, I think you maybe are already co-hosts. Yes, you should both have the ability to share screen. Okay. So we have a full group in your session. There's supposed to be 5 presenters, so we'll hang on for a little while. Thanks, Chris. Just waiting for our additional presenters.
Great. Have fun.
Thank you. Good morning, Emma.
Good morning.
My name is Irina Ellison, and I'm the moderator for the session. And Emily and Liana are presenters along with you. And we have just a few others that we're waiting for this morning as well.
Awesome. Nice to meet you all.
Nice to meet you too. Good morning, Amy. We're anticipating 2 more presenters, so we'll give them a couple more minutes and then maybe start, pretty much on time or maybe 1 minute after, something like that. All right, it's 9 a.m. I think we're going to get started. So welcome again. Thank you all for being here. My name is Irina Ellison. I'm going to be moderating the session, and the session is Public Health 1, Physical and Mental Health. As part of my other role, outside of honors, I'm chair of natural sciences at Mercy College. So I'm really excited to hear your presentations this morning. And of course, such timely topics given everything that's going on in the world today. So I'm going to introduce all of you first, and then we'll go through pretty much in order of the presentations. We have about 12 minutes or so for you each to present. And then we'll do some questions at the end as well. So our first presenter is Emily Alessandrini from Salisbury University. And her topic is, how does one approach the elimination of healthcare acquired infection, 1 glucose test strip at a time? We have Hana Amer from Macaulay Honors College and CUNY. And her presentation is Neglected Crisis, Impact of Famine on Mental Health of the Yemeni Population. Then our next presenter is Liana Foianini. Hopefully I didn't butcher your last name too badly. Also from Salisbury University, and your topic is Breathless, Fran Lung and Pulmonary Edema. And Emma Brown from the University of Hartford, and your topic is Physical Therapy and the Arts Combined for the Pursuit of Well-Rounded Healing. So welcome to our presenters. Welcome to our other participants. Thank you, Jennifer, for joining us. And Emily, you can get started whenever you're ready.
Awesome. So can you guys hear me? Okay.
We can hear you and we can see you, so we're all set.
Awesome. Okay, so hi, my name is Emily Alessandrini, and today I'm going to be presenting my research that tested the survivability of clinically significant organisms on blood glucose test strips. So to start off, I'm going to explain to you what healthcare acquired infection is and relate it to the glucose monitoring process. Then I'm going to explain what information is missing from the current research field and how my research can contribute. I'll finally explain my experiment, share my findings, and suggest possible solutions. So what is healthcare acquired infection? So this refers to any infection that is transmitted to a patient in the healthcare setting while receiving treatment. So these infections are typically started from the contamination created from the mishandling or lack of proper sanitation of medical devices in between patients. So in other words, if the patient uses a device that carries infection from another patient, the infection can potentially spread. So as we can see from the figure here, healthcare acquired infection is responsible for an estimated 2 million infections and 99,000 deaths yearly in America, making it one of the most common causes of morbidity and mortality. However, because not everything is known about healthcare acquired infection yet, it's predicted that the numbers are actually much higher. But healthcare acquired infection is theoretically preventable. So in theory, if a device is not contaminated, it can spread infection. So to get rid of healthcare acquired infection, you need to get rid of contamination. However, that is easier said than done. So if you take the mind, lack of knowledge that we have on the subject. But there has been like certain places, certain fields that have tried to reduce healthcare acquired infection, such as like name dating of wearing gloves and washing hands in the medical field. So let's look into the glucose monitoring process. So this process, you can see a lot of examples of healthcare acquired infections being transmitted. Like the name states, the purpose of glucose monitoring process is to monitor the glucose levels or sugar levels in the blood. So this is mostly used by diabetics who need to know their blood glucose levels in order to provide proper treatment. However, it is also used in pre-diabetics and some other diseases and endocrine disorders, all of whom are immunocompromised, meaning more likely to get healthcare acquired infection. So the instruments used in this process are the finger prick lancet, the glucometer, and the blood glucose test strips. So the finger prick punctures the patient's finger, exposing the patient's blood. And then the blood is pressed onto the glucose test strip, like you can see in this picture. And then the strip is placed into the glucometer, which gives the blood glucose concentration. So the finger prick device and glucometer, if properly cleaned and utilized, can be used multiple times. But the glucose test strips can only be used one time. You use it in one patient and you throw it away. I'm primarily going to be focusing on the glucose test strip because that's what I did my research on. So glucose test strips typically come in vials that contain 25 to 50 strips, although some manufacturers do sell them in tens or hundreds. The vial that I used was about 50 vial strips, and it's very, very small. It's about like this wide. So with the increasing prevalence of diabetes, the use of glucose monitoring devices is increasing, and with that, the risk of healthcare acquired infection. So in 2010, we discovered that the glucometer and the finger prick lancet have been contaminated. And because of that, we started putting out new regulations regarding cleaning procedures. And then also this mandate saying that only one finger prick lancet per patient, which makes a lot of sense because you can't really spread anything that way. But because the multi-use vials containing glucose test strips are still typically shared between patients in a short time frame called serial testing, contamination could potentially spread quickly. So there are no official procedures for the glucose test strip, and this is because it was just recently discovered that these strips are being contaminated. And then because these strips are so small and primarily held in the small multi-use vials, when a medical professional goes in to grab a strip, they end up touching the other strips in the vial. But how could this cause contamination? If the medical professional's hands were not properly sterilized in between patients or between tests of a single patient, which is sometimes the case, it is possible for the strips to get contaminated, which could spread healthcare acquired infection to the next patient. Some studies believe that when medical professionals have to conduct multiple tests on a patient, they don't change their gloves, like I previously stated. But another way their hands are potentially getting contaminated is from the contaminated glucometer or other equipment in the room. So even if they wash their hands, change their gloves, everything's sterilized, they go to touch something else after everything's clean, they get recontaminated, and then they go to touch another strip, and then these strips in the vial are now contaminated. So when these strips are contaminated, they can go directly into the next patient's bloodstream. So that means like the bacteria, anything that's on it, goes directly into the next patient, which could cause a lot of different issues. One of the examples is being sepsis. So this won't affect too much the current patient being tested because the contamination is on the strip. It can go to anyone else in the future. But there's one important question that all of these studies failed to ask. How long can the contaminant live? Survivability. So there are currently no published studies that have researched the survivability of contaminants on blood glucose test strips, but this needs to be known because if the bacteria or the contaminant on it doesn't live, it can't contaminate the next person. It can't infect anyone. It doesn't have that ability. But if it does live, then it has the potential to infect. So that's what I did because it's needed. Specifically, I tested Acinetobacter baumannii, Candida albicans, Klebsiella pneumoniae, and Proteus mirabilis. So these organisms are chosen just because number one, they're in UTIs, which is the most common healthcare acquired infection, accounting for 32%. But also, it was found, it's very common in people with diabetes. But most importantly, these bacteria were found on glucose test strips in previous studies. So these were perfect organisms to test. Before I could even start this experiment, though, I had to know how many organisms were in each culture, so then I could dilute it to a specific number, so we can just keep the results consistent throughout. So to do this, I conducted a serial dilution. So basically, if you don't know what this is, it's when you dilute the original broth in a specific way in order to dilute it. So this picture is a perfect representation. You just take the original broth and then you dilute it, and then you take that and dilute it again. So eventually you can find a plate that has a good amount of colonies you can count and use this to calculate how much was in the original inoculum. So once I knew how much the original inoculum had, I was able to dilute it to a certain number. And the number that I use 100,000 CFU, which is what doctors use to diagnose UTI. And then also it's not a crazy number, a crazy high number. It's actually relatively small, but this is technically like what they use to diagnose UTI. So we just had to pick a number. So after I diluted it, I put 10 microliters on each space. So meaning I put 2,000 approximate colonies on each strip. So I put it on spot A and spot C. So spot A is where the patient's blood actually goes directly in contact with the strip, and spot C is where the medical professional is supposed to grab it. However, these strips are about like that big, so it's very possible that these spots can overlap. Another reason why I put it on both spots is because these are slightly different plastics, so I wanted to see if it affected growth, and it didn't at all. But I put it on both spots, and then time for the fun part when I could actually test. So each day after it dried, I placed a strip onto a plate and then I pressed it for 30 seconds. So this is mimicking the time that the patient is exposed to the actual contaminant. After the 30 seconds, I threw away the strip, and then I did that every single day. I just took a new strip every day just to see if the bacteria was still present on these strips, if it was still viable. And then I also put a positive and negative control. So the positive control is the original inoculum. So this just proves that it's still viable, that these organisms are still alive. The negative was what I used to dilute it. It was phosphate buffered saline. And then this just shows that there was no contaminants in it. There's nothing else affecting it. So over here, you can see the Candida plate. I used a separate plate just because it's a yeast, so it needed a different chrome agar to work. I put Acinetobacter baumannii and Klebsiella on the same plate. This is Mueller-Hinton chrome agar, just so that we can see the colors. They differentiate very easily. Originally, the Proteus was also on this plate, but for some reason, the Proteus swarmed. It took over the entire plate, and I kept on having to start over. So we decided that the best way to measure the growth is to put it on the conky, which limits its growth. So that's why it's on a separate plate over here. So what are my results? So these are my results right here. This just basically means that it survived for 6 days. It survived for 2 days, and after that, growth was no longer present. For the hours, I just did the same procedure. I just tested every single hour for 24 hours if it didn't live past a day in my original experiment, just to see how long this could potentially infect somebody. So basically what this means is that if we look at the baumannii, for example, the glucose test strips still had contaminants on it for 6 days, meaning that it could infect people for 6 days. And these glucose test strips aren't supposed to support life, and yet these can live for that long of a time. I mean, in serial testing, especially in hospitals, how many people could get these bacteria directly into their bloodstream? It's a lot to think about. So another person from my college, from Salisbury University, did the same experiment, but with different organisms. So her results were much more crazy than me. As we can see, like some antibiotics resistance stuff survived past 50 days. We couldn't go farther than that because we had 50 strips to start with. So after the 50 days, there was still stuff there. And that's insane. Think about how many people can be infected in 50 days. If the shelf life for the strips are way longer, so in theory it could go on, but we don't know how long. That's another thing that we should probably look into. But what's next? How do we solve this problem? Because obviously this could cause healthcare acquired infection. Well, obviously the first one is proper hand sanitization. So in between tests, medical professionals aren't washing their hands necessarily or changing gloves. So they could be like doing something around the UTI area, just like changing a catheter or doing a pelvic exam. But then because they don't properly wash their hands, properly change their gloves, when they go in to reach the thing, that's when the contamination is being spread. But however, this is not very easy to enforce just because this should be happening already. But because there is a time crunch in these hospital settings and they don't know that necessarily the glucose test strips can be a transmitter, they just think if they change their gloves in between patients, everything will be fine. But unfortunately, that's not the case. But this is very difficult to enforce. So my suggestion to fix this problem is to individually package each glucose test strip. And this is how it originally was, how everything was, but because it's more expensive this way. It takes, because it's in bulk, 50 in one vial rather than one per package. So it's more expensive, and it's also more environmentally friendly. But as we can see, as we're finding, is that healthcare acquired infection caused by these glucose test strips are actually causing more money. So each person getting infected, again, has to stay longer in the hospital. So it's actually, they're thinking it's an average of $3,400 per patient. So getting infected. So it's actually cheaper to go back to the individually packaged glucose test strips, and then it's safer. The only downside is that it isn't as environmentally friendly. But I think this is the best way to go in order to save as many people. And so in conclusion, so organisms can survive on these glucose test strips for clinically significant amount of time, meaning that people can get infected. So obviously that's a problem, but in order to fight healthcare acquired infection, we need to look at each individual part of healthcare acquired infection. I focus on the glucose test strip. And to solve this problem, I think that they should be individually packaged. I think it just makes more financial and health sense. But yeah, this is a problem that we need to fix. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Emily.
Yep, thanks.
Our next presenter is Hana Amer. And Hana is presenting again on the neglected crisis impact of famine on mental health of the Yemeni population. So Hana, you should be all set. Yep. We can see your screen now.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, great. So my topic is the neglected crisis impact of famine on the mental health of the Yemeni population. My name is Hana Amer, and I'm a senior at Macaulay Honors College. And today, this is the topic that I'm going to be presenting. So as a Yemeni American with immigrant parents, I hear many stories about the crisis of the Yemeni population from my family, particularly from my father, who describes stuff when he goes to visit his family and friends and his sick relatives. His words and descriptions are often very upsetting, and just listening to him, I realized that there's so many worrisome thoughts and actions that were completely normalized due to the harsh reality of the country. Whereas I believe that the health of the mind is just as important as the health of the body, my relatives had this idea that we should just be grateful to be alive and to ignore mental illness instead of address it. And I was just very curious to see how people were truly feeling. And I created this survey just to see how people are coping with the devastating impact of the effects of the war and of the famine, which I will discuss in a few minutes. But in order for us to really understand everything, we just have to understand the history of Yemen, particularly in the last few years that have led to Yemen's current state. And just a quick summary, in 2015, the Yemen Civil War began with a rebel group known as Houthis. And in 2016, Saudi Arabia got involved and led a coalition that invaded Yemen. And tens of thousands of civilians have been killed and injured during the conflict, with these two parties committing a bunch of war crimes and humanitarian law against the civilian population. And both of these parties have created these blockades that have restricted any type of assistance from entering Yemen. And since Yemen imports over 90% of its food supply, the blockades have had a severe impact on the food supply in Yemen, which is now considered the largest man-made hunger. This ongoing war in Yemen has created the world's largest food security emergency and the largest cholera epidemic ever recorded. And millions have been sent into poverty, the nation's economy has been destroyed, and basic public services have evaporated. And Yemen is currently facing another struggle, which is COVID. So when attempting to actually visualize Yemen's current state, it's really hard for people to picture how many people are in desperate need of assistance. So imagine if Yemen was only 100 people. In this case, 80 need humanitarian aid to survive, 60 have nothing to eat, 58 have no access to clean water, 52 have no access to healthcare, and 11 are malnourished. But Yemen isn't 100 people. Yemen is 30.5 million people. And there are approximately 24 million in need of humanitarian assistance and 18 million in need of food. So in order to understand the mental health in Yemen, you must understand Yemen's current medical status. And due to the bombings and blockades, most hospitals are not fully functional. Right here, these are some stats taken from the World Health Organization's Health Resources Availability Mapping System, and it shows that out of a total of 3,507 surveyed health facilities, only 45% are fully functional, and 38% are partially functional, and 17% are non-functional. And furthermore, there's only 2 doctors or less in the 42% of the surveyed districts, and hospitals and medical facilities are overwhelmed, and they just really can't handle the number of sick people that are there. Also, there's many barriers to mental health in Yemen. One of these barriers is stigma. Many people don't believe in mental health and instead see mental health as like a myth or a superstition or a sign of lack of faith. And lots of people hide their mental illness out of shame. And as Yemen is a Muslim majority country, people believe that mental illness is just being a bad Muslim, or they believe that only religious intervention is needed in order to quote unquote cure mental illness. So they just try to do stuff like Quranic therapeutic centers, which just read verses over you. And furthermore, there's like a major sin for one to harm themselves in Islam. So acts like suicides are condemned and shamed. So people often bury their state of mind. And they're just always in fear that people are going to judge them or expose them for even thinking of self-harm. And since these stigmas surround mental health are not addressed, it's evident that the majority of the country does not understand what mental health is and how to manage it. Another reason that mental health is not seen as vital to many Yemenis is because of the little to no access to mental health resources. So less than 21% of the facilities have any type of mental health conditions. There's 3,580 professionals with at least a BA in psychology, but of these, only 45 are psychiatrists or neurologists. So that makes like a ratio of 1 psychiatrist or neurologist for every 500,000 people in Yemen. Furthermore, there's only 3 child psychiatrists, and there's only 4 psychiatric hospitals in total, and those don't actually treat children. These hospitals are only limited to adults, and sometimes mental health outpatient clinics are tried to be made in public hospitals, but they're usually short-lived because of just like staff shortages and budget constraints. So on top of all this, there's very few doctors that actually understand how to recognize and properly treat mental disorders, because there's no official way of diagnosing it in Yemen. And another barrier that Yemeni people face is discrimination in coverage for mental disorders. There's around 45 private clinics. And since these clinics use drugs and ultra-conversive therapy unaffordable to most, all these widespread effects are very limited. And these private health clinics with their mental health specialists are only located in cities, which makes them completely inaccessible for people who are living in rural areas that are unaware of or cannot afford these types of treatments. So the mental health survey that I created, it spanned many topics ranging from like basic demographic information such as like age, occupation, economic status, and family size, to questions that really focus on perceptions of food, sleeping schedule, and mental status. My father distributed the survey on his recent trip to Yemen to many different places like the store, mosques, and in the streets. And the survey was of 12 Yemeni men between the ages of 17 to 52. And as men take on like the traditional role as providers for their families, which is even more expected in times of famine, the scarcity of food available has really caused immense pressure. And since there's an extreme shortage of food in Yemen, I decided to ask the men, what are 3 things you think about when you hear the word food? Every person stated that food was too expensive and that there was a shortage of food in the country. While 75% of the men stated that they had jobs, the majority reported that 50% or more of their monthly income went solely on food. And such an overwhelming response highlights both the massive shortage of food due to wartime interruption of imports and the resulting inflation of food prices stemming from the scarcity of just basic staple. Fully 75% of the men mentioned that the businesses hold like some type of monopoly on food and basic necessities. And since lots of businesses were forced to close either due to being destroyed by the war or just financial problems in general, the surviving businesses now have full control over pricing. The result is that many people are not able to afford the basic items, and the remaining 25% of men associated the word food with just hunger. 100% of the men responded that they had trouble providing for their family due to lack of resources and inflated prices. And furthermore, all of the men noted that they noticed more people begging for money in the streets. And this rise in homelessness, people begging, just shows that how families are like really struggling to put food on the table and just to put a roof over their heads. And such unanimity in these responses shows how detrimental the economic status of Yemen truly is. And all the respondents reported that the pressure to provide for their family has negatively impacted their mental health. 83.3% stated that the struggle to provide for their family made them feel very guilty, compounded by the guilt of seeing people starving on the street and not being able to help them. Nearly all of the men, 91.7%, stated that they have witnessed an intense event that has caused fear, helplessness, or sadness. And some of the men explained how they have seen like family members or friends, dead bodies on the ground. Others spoke about how their villages and how their homes were destroyed. All the men stated that they constantly felt anxiety, they felt anxious and nervous, and 91.7% of the men stated that they have trouble sleeping. Relaxing, sorry. Furthermore, 58.3% of the men stated that they feel depressed. 25% responded that they sometimes felt depressed. And these responses really show how through famine and war, Yemenis could very well be experiencing many different mental illnesses, including PTSD, anxiety, stress, depression, and they're left unaddressed. Sleep plays a vital role in one's mental health, so therefore it's very troubling to see that 75% stated that they have trouble going to sleep. Studies show how lack of sleep can lead to psychiatric disorders. So inconsistent sleep schedules and lack of sleep, which is often caused by mental illness, such as stress, depression, and anxiety, among others, they can further exacerbate some of the symptoms of mental illness. So it stands to reason that the impact of years of war and famine is resulting in a cycle of mental health and sleep problems. In order to understand if these men were attempting to like self-medicate themselves in order to feel better, I asked them if they were chewing khat more frequently. Khat plays a very important role in Yemen. This plant is like chewed for its euphoric and stimulant effects. And those immediate effects include reduced feelings of fatigue, suppressed appetite, alertness, and increase in talking. But however, long-term effects can lead to like increase in blood pressure, tooth decay, ulcers, tumors, and just much more. And interestingly, 50% claim that they started to chew khat more as like a coping mechanism during the famine, whereas the other 50% stated that they already chewed khat consistently prior to the famine. And the fact that all these men said that they chew khat, while half said that they started to chew khat more, shows how pivotal khat is as a form of like relaxation and self-medication against stress and other factors. So despite the fact that there's ample evidence providing the connection between hunger and mental disorders, no programs are being like instituted to address and improve the mental health of the Yemeni community. And here you can just see that since Yemenis are being forced to like live with the deaths of their loved ones, hunger, famine, and COVID-19, it's really, they have little to no access in their healthcare. The risk of poor mental health is very high, so it's beyond concerning to see that steps are not being addressed. And funding is really needed here in order to improve the current state of Yemen. And the United Nations is trying to ask for $3.85 billion in order to address the impoverished country. However, this year in 2021, they just said that they were only able to raise $1.7 billion. And the UN chief has deemed this number disappointing. There are many people claiming that the cut to aid in from like 3.85 to just $1.7 billion is not going to be enough to actually solve the problem in Yemen. And the actual amount that they received is never truly enough to like treat the country holistically. So money ends up being focused only on food and medical supplies rather than on like rehabilitation, the fixing of like infrastructure, and on setting up programs to really improve the mental health and social well-being of Yemen. So funding is really needed to like be pushed into programs like these two that I have right here, which are called the Yemeni Psychiatric and Neurological Association and the Yemeni Mental Health Association. These are both two non-government organizations which are really struggling to provide care due to their lack of funds. And furthermore, the whole country needs to like really rewire their previous notions on mental health in order to decrease that massive stigma that there currently is and force people to stop hiding their problems. In order to do this, more people should really be encouraged to pursue paths in psychiatry. I'm sorry, psychiatry. And furthermore, it's true that the country should be encouraged into pursuing these paths. And the country is in desperate need of many other things, obviously, like food and water. But as Alessandrini once said, like if Yemen is going to actually have any type of future stability, the country really needs to psychologically rebuild. So mental health is really, it's not a privilege, it's a right for every human being on earth. And the goal should not be just to keep Yemeni people alive. It should really be to allow people, Yemenis, to thrive both mentally and physically.
Great. Thank you so much. Wonderful presentation. Very interesting and timely topics. Thank you so much for that. Our next presenter is Veda Chandwani from Siena College, and her topic is implementing a solution for burnout in healthcare workers in hospitals and medical schools. So welcome, Veda.
Hi.
Hi.
Let me share my screen, sorry. So my topic was, as you said, implementing a solution to burnout for healthcare workers in medical schools and hospitals. So burnout is when healthcare professionals work past their point of energy depletion. And so it's defined by three main symptoms: emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and personal accomplishment. And emotional exhaustion is when someone's emotional energy is depleted. So healthcare professionals feel like they have more responsibilities than they can handle. And because this is a symptom that's most often studied, a lot of researchers try to argue that the other two symptoms aren't as needed. Depersonalization is when someone feels detached, so they're impersonal with their patients and they lose passion for their work. And then personal accomplishment, that just means like feeling unaccomplished in your work. So burnout is measured by the Maslow Burnout Inventory, also known as the MBI, and it's a survey that checks for these three symptoms in patients. Because of that, it's considered the standard when measuring burnout. So there are cutoff scores in every category in the MBI, and it separates people into 4 categories: no burnout, low burnout, moderate burnout, and high burnout. So there are 4 main causes of burnout when I did my research. And so the first one is electronic health records, or EHRs. So it's found that an average of 16 minutes and 14 seconds of every patient encounter is spent using an EHR. And this causes a lot of healthcare professionals to have to bring their work home because they're expected to see anywhere from 2 to 4 patients an hour. Clerical duties is the second most common cause, because we'll see that residents spend about 40% of their time working on a computer. And even when they become physicians, they spend anywhere from 15 to 30% of their time on paperwork, charting, etc. So that's contributing to worsening mental health. And a lot of healthcare professionals believe that it's actually this which is their major cause of burnout. So I combine clerical duties and EHRs because in this paper, just because a lot of our clerical duties are being shifted to electronic health records just because of the shift in technology. And then increased time demands is another major cause. And that's because when we compare the general population to those working in healthcare, about 40% of people feel like they don't have a satisfactory work-life balance, which is significant. And then the fourth major cause is lack of self-care, because a lot of healthcare professionals participate in maladaptive techniques that help, like eating junk food, alcohol and drug abuse, prescription drug abuse, nicotine use, and binge eating. So a lot of the literature does encourage yoga as a healthy and meditative way to cope with stress. So in terms of medical schools, medical school education isn't evolving, and that's because creating a change in medical schools is slow due to the requirements from the Liaison Committee on Medical Education. So a lot of the parts of being a doctor haven't really changed, or working in healthcare haven't really changed, like clinical knowledge and communicating with patients, but other aspects have changed dramatically, and this is because we've moved towards technology, like using EHRs, and physicians and other healthcare professionals are required to take on a lot of non-clinical roles. So a lot of medical schools aren't willing to address these because they're conservative and risk averse. And so changing the curriculum in more prestigious medical schools is difficult. And then newer medical schools don't want to change because they want to stay on par with the top tier institutions. I will acknowledge that some schools are trying to implement wellness programs and wellness clubs like Stanford. So based on the research I saw, the Maris model was the best intervention in medical schools. And this model addresses the 4 most beneficial components in decreasing medical student burnout. And so those 4 components are mindfulness practice, effective reflection, impactive experiences, and creating supportive, safe learning space. And because this specific intervention incorporated these 4 components, they were combining the best parts of all of the previous studies done. And they did this through 21 3-hour workshops using facilitators and simulated patients. And so every workshop began with a large group session, and the students learned the background of the topic of that day. And then during the workshop, students were put into groups of 6, and they were put into the same group of 6 for all 21 sessions with the same facilitator to create that supportive and safe learning environment. And then the students would review the material from the large group interaction and do a mindfulness exercise. And then each student would interact with a simulated patient. And there were 6 simulated patients, each with a different scenario. And then after, your group would watch you interact, and then you would self-reflect and you would get feedback from your group. And then there was reflective journaling at the end to help the facilitators figure out which students needed more help in developing these skills. So there were a lot of other interventions, but this one seemed to be the best. And in terms of hospital interventions, there are 2 major types of interventions. There's individual and structural. So that means they either target the individual person or they try to change the context of the situation. So in terms of individual interventions, these have a very controversial impact because they're not thought to be the best solution when it comes to creating a massive change. So a lot of mindfulness interventions include yoga and meditation, it's taught in a group setting, and then participants are expected to practice these interventions on their own time, which is obviously difficult because that's really self-geared, and it depends on how much effort every individual is willing to put in to fix their burnout and their mental health. So the other type of individual intervention is small-scale counseling and education, and that's implemented on the hospital level. And so these have been effective in the short term because the professional receives a few days or a few weeks of counseling, but because these programs end quickly, a lot of longitudinal studies found that whatever they learned in these programs, that effect wasn't seen years later. However, I do still think we need counseling in healthcare. So one such intervention that I saw that I thought was the best in terms of providing counseling on a larger scale was called MedNet. And this is currently only available in London, but it is all across London, so it's not as small scale as on the hospital level. So this program had a lot of consultant psychiatrists on staff, and they could take on practicing physicians as a client for up to 6 sessions, and a small number could be taken on for a longer period of time. And during the counseling sessions, the psychiatrists addressed issues in medical practice, work-life balance, individual problems, and internal conflicts. So because doctors and other healthcare professionals can be a little reluctant to seek help because of the stigma, this program allowed physicians to self-refer. And then in terms of structural interventions, there were quite a few of them, but the most common were changing the work week to a maximum of 80 hours a week rather than the previous average of 100, and changing medical practice through improving communication and workflow. So in a lot of studies, this was done by sending out a survey to every hospital and deciding what the most common issues that needed to be addressed are. So major communication interventions included monthly clinician meetings, emails from leaders about updates, and reviewing work schedules. And then major workflow interventions included using medical assistants for the EHR data, pairing every physician with a medical assistant, and adjusting the on-call schedule. And because of this, the best structural intervention I noticed was to find the categories that need the most change and then implement a few of those strategies in hospitals across the US. So to decide the best, to create like such a big change in our society, we have to begin at the public health level. So I used the Friden's Health Impact Pyramid to describe the best way to create an intervention in public healthcare and healthcare infrastructure. And the basic idea is that the interventions at the lower levels of the pyramid are broader and they require less individual effort, but they do require a large societal impact. And then the higher levels, you have to put more effort in as an individual. So this led me to believe that changing public policy was the best way to go about this. And so on the medical school level, the best way to do this was to create and incorporate classes, but on a mass scale so that it's not so easily forgettable. So that's why I said the Maris program was the best intervention, which I described earlier, because it does have counseling education, but it also changes the context of an individual's default decisions, which if you look at the pyramid, it's closer to the bottom, so it has a grander impact. So to change the context properly, we have to modify public policy, and to do this, we have to create more awareness of the problem along with the best solutions. So yes, there's increasing awareness of healthcare workers suffering from burnout, but right now there haven't been any long-term techniques incorporated into medical school curriculum. That's why I suggested that we create a change on an individual scale in a newer medical school where a class can be taught, and then once that gains the approval of the LCME, which is the Liaison Committee of Medical Education, then it could become a requirement at all accredited schools. And then changing public policy at the hospital level. So I did talk about MedNet earlier, which was counseling on a larger scale. So because the COVID-19 pandemic has caused telehealth to become a really common way for patients to interact with healthcare providers, we can do this through telehealth, especially because the pandemic has caused increasing levels of depression, anxiety, and burnout in healthcare workers. So with the cooperation of different mental health professionals, we could expand telehealth services to form the electronic equivalent of MedNet in the United States. So this way, healthcare professionals would have easy access to a lot of confidential and secure counseling interventions from any location. And then in terms of structural interventions, I suggested that we do the same as the best one I found earlier, which was incorporating multiple techniques. So yes, these were in the tested interventions I saw, these were curated based on the site and what healthcare workers thought were the worst problems at every site. But that's not really possible when we're working on mass implementation. So we could do research studies of diverse hospitals and healthcare facilities, and to decide which problems are the most significant and common in the majority of institutions. And then using the Foianini pyramid as a guide, the best interventions could be identified and applied to every single site. So policy changes in healthcare facilities can be really long and difficult because there's a lot of layers of administration to go through and regulatory agencies want to comply with. So for these interventions to become widely available, we would have to demonstrate a decrease in burnout to hospital administrations and regulatory agencies. So if one hospital board my idea was that if one hospital board can be convinced to make a change after being shown the positive effect of past research on an individual and a structural level, then more hospital boards can be convinced as well. And then it's with that influence that the intervention can be brought into the public eye for long enough that it can influence a change in public policy. That's all.
Great, thank you so much. Wonderful. Our next presenter is Liana from Salisbury University. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Liana. And then after Liana, we have Emma. And what we'll do after Emma goes is we'll do a quick just screen grab so that we have a photo of this session happening. So I'm going to pass it on now to Liana. Thank you.
All right, so hi everyone, my name is Liana, and my presentation is on Fran lung and pulmonary edema. So obviously we have a couple of questions. What is Fran? Fran is a benchmark workout in CrossFit that consists of 21, 15, and 9 repetitions of thrusters and strict pull-ups. And this workout is completed 4 times. And then some other questions. What are thrusters? So a thruster is a front squat into an overhead press that is done consecutively and as smooth as possible. So it is basically a full body workout. And then a strict pull-up is a pull-up that is done without utilizing any momentum. So if any of you have heard of CrossFit, you've probably seen videos of people doing like butterfly pull-ups where it doesn't look like they're doing a pull-up at all. In Fran, they specifically say you're not allowed to do that. You have to do a pull-up regularly. Another question might be, what is Fran lung? Fran lung is a set of respiratory symptoms that is caused by doing the workout Fran. And these symptoms include coughing, sputum production, metallic taste, wheezing, headache, hoarseness, the whole works. And what's weird about it is it occurs in 90% of athletes who perform Fran, and it occurs in athletes who normally don't get respiratory symptoms when doing workouts. So they either don't have asthma, they don't have other respiratory problems, but they still get these respiratory symptoms while doing Fran. And it is speculated that Fran lung is due to interstitial pulmonary edema. So interstitial pulmonary edema is excess extravascular lung water that collects in the interstitial space. And the interstitial space is the space between the alveolar epithelium and then the capillary endothelium. So it's in that little space right in there. And this can cause trouble breathing and other symptoms that align with Fran lung. And so mechanisms for this would be an increase due to hydrostatic pressure, so pressure of the water in the pulmonary capillaries. And This is due to an increase in venous return that puts pressure on the heart to pump more blood, which will increase pulmonary pressure and can push water into the interstitial space. And in order for that to occur, the heart has to be working at its maximum, but the demand for oxygen has to be greater. So in other words, the heart has to be pumping as much as it can, but more venous return has to be coming back than the heart can pump. So this causes a backup that leads all the way back to the respiratory capillaries, or the pulmonary capillaries, and increases the hydrostatic pressure in there, pushing water out of the capillaries. Another mechanism that could cause this is an increase in capillary permeability, and this allows more water to go through the capillary walls, and this can be due to either damage or an increased surface area. And then the third is the inability of lymphatic tissues to sufficiently clear the water that has been pushed out. One of the lymph tissues' function is to clear excess water that may get pushed out, because it is semi-normal as long as it's not too high of a level. And so if the lymph tissue cannot clear it out fast enough, then a buildup will occur. And all it takes is just a small amount of fluid in the interstitial space to cause a change in these lung tissue mechanics. So does exercise cause pulmonary edema? I looked at this to kind of look at why certain exercises can cause this, and as like a level, like, hey, probably don't want to go past these exercises or this intensity if you don't want any of these symptoms. And there have only been a few cases of people that have been clinically diagnosed with pulmonary edema after exercise. One person was doing a 90-kilometer race. There was another one doing a transcontinental cycle. And then others were marathon runners. So all of them were participating in extreme forms of exercise. And one of them actually had a heart valve dysfunction, causing them to be predisposed to pulmonary edema. And because of that, they think that all the others had another cause that was undiagnosed that predisposed them. And so based on this, if exercise can cause pulmonary edema in the average athletes, then it must be at a subclinical level, because they're not able to see like a huge change. There are many different ways to measure pulmonary edema. I looked at 3 different types. There's the CT scan, which is a quick imaging test, but it uses ionizing radiation, so it's not ideal for multiple tests in a short time span. And then there's the MRI, which actually gives more sensitive images, but it has the patient in the supine position, which can change how the lung water looks in the lungs, rather than when they're standing up. And it can also take 30 minutes to an hour to complete, which could possibly, by that time, the patient or the athlete could have returned back to normal by that time. And there is also the ventilation perfusion mismatch. And this isn't an imaging sort of imaging, it's more a ratio of the volume of gas inhaled to the volume of gas that reaches the pulmonary capillaries. And this is often used if imaging is not available, and as a faster method as well. Is pulmonary edema caused by exercise? The fatigability of respiratory muscles could possibly lead to increased oxygen demand and an increase in venous return. So the diaphragm and core fatigue is usually shown after 80% of their VO2 max, so higher than 80% after a sustained period of time. And it usually is due to a full body exercise. One experiment used arm ergometers and found that just upper body was not enough to cause respiratory fatigue. And that can be questioned because, and the arm ergometer is a movement where you're kind of going like this, which is different than free body weights and other upper body and overhead exercises. And so the reason that the diaphragm and the core muscles take so long to fatigue is because they're largely slow twitch and they're very difficult to fatigue, but they can with full body exercise. And they can also fatigue when you have a high ventilation rate, which is that high intensity again. And then another experiment had participants using bikes at a high intensity and concluded that pulmonary edema is unlikely to occur. And again, this can be questioned because bikes, in my own personal experiences, bikes do not elicit the same effect on the lungs and the heart. So I used to run and then we would bike sometimes, and running and biking, I would breathe a lot heavier running than I did biking. And so that can be questioned as to whether lower body exercises, other lower body exercises and full body exercises could cause that pulmonary edema, whereas bikes might not. And there is lots of evidence that pulmonary edema is triggered by exercise. One study compared 11 different studies, and they looked at the subjects, they looked at what imaging was used, and the modes of exercises as well. And they split them up into 3 different groups. There was the prolonged group, which was 50 to 75% of their VO2 max at 15 minutes to 2 hours, but they did not go to exhaustion. There was the stress testing, the GXT, which was where they performed VO2 max tests. And this usually lasts for 16 to 20 minutes at a max for 2 minutes, and they're at their VO2 max for around 2 minutes. And then there was the max exercises, which is where they were at or near their VO2 max and they went until exhaustion or for several minutes. And the results of this study, they found that in the prolonged group, 16% showed signs of pulmonary edema, 0% showed signs in the stress testing group, and then 65% showed signs of the pulmonary edema in the max group. And the signs of pulmonary edema occurred independent of hypoxia, fitness level, and then the time between the end of exercise and when they did the imaging, and the types of imaging. And so this shows that if pulmonary edema occurs, it is at a mild level, and the exercise must be a maximal full body exercise with little to no break for several minutes or until exhaustion. So does Fran cause pulmonary edema? 3 things that we're looking for: it has to be maximal effort, it has to be a full body exercise, and there has to be little to no break for several minutes or until exhaustion. Now, there are very few experiments that look at the metabolic reaction of CrossFit workouts. So I looked at 3 different studies, 2 of which did not perform Fran, and 1 of them did. So the metabolic profile of a CrossFit training bout, this was one of the studies I looked at. It was as many rounds as possible of 12 box jumps, 6 thrusters, and 6 bar facing burpees in 12 minutes. So they did the 12, 6, 6 over and over again for 12 minutes. Their mean VO2 was 37.2 milliliters per kilogram per minute. And there was an unknown VO2 max, so they don't know the percentage of the VO2 max. The mean respiratory exchange ratio is 1.4, which is greater than 1.0, which is the cutoff for indicating anaerobic metabolism, which is usually used to see if it is a high intensity workout or not. And their blood lactate was at 12.6 millimoles per liter, which is greater than 8 millimoles per liter, which is usually used to indicate anaerobic metabolism as well. So this was concluded to be a very high intensity workout. Another workout, you looked at 3 different styles of CrossFit workouts. So there was gymnastics movement, metabolic conditioning, and weightlifting. The max heart rates were all over 90% of their heart rate max. The rate of perceived exertion, so this is how tired and difficult the athletes thought that it felt, were all either hard or very hard. The blood lactate level was all over the 8 millimoles per liter. So all 3 types of workouts were concluded to be high intensity. And the final study looked at Fran. Their average heart rate was at 95.4% of their heart rate max. They were at 56.7% of their VO2 max, which isn't all that high, but they spent 76% of the workout time above an RER of 1. Their RPE was an 8.4 out of 10, and their blood lactate level was well over the 8 millimoles per liter. And it actually continued to stay elevated 5 minutes after exercise. So even though they weren't at super high VO2 max, it's still considered a high intensity workout. And so I concluded that it is likely that Fran does kind of give a little bit of an interstitial pulmonary edema, but it is a very mild level, and it is quickly fixed by the body. Because Fran is high intensity, it's full body, it lasts for several minutes. The fact that the workout is for time means that the athletes have little to no break. The break that they do is something that they give themselves, it's not prescribed. And more research, I believe, should be done on exercise-induced pulmonary edema and high-intensity full-body workouts, like Fran, in order to learn more and identify any other potential mechanisms behind these irregular symptoms, so that we can then figure out, like, hey, don't go above this level of exercise if you don't want these symptoms. They're not life-threatening, so obviously if you don't mind, it's not a huge deal, but people trying to get into exercise, we don't want them to go away feeling that it was awful and they're never going to exercise again. And these are my references.
Great, Liana. Thank you so much. Very interesting. And last but not least, we have Emma.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Emma Brown, and I'll be talking to you about my research in physical therapy integrated with the arts. So first, just a little background about my research. I was inspired to begin this project from my personal passions for the arts, especially dance and music, and my professional passion for pursuing a career in physical therapy. So I really wanted to see if it was possible to combine both of these passions and hopefully enhance patient care. So I sought out a faculty mentor, and together we tackled this project. And I narrowed down this idea to a research question, which was, can physical therapy practice be significantly enhanced with the inclusion of the arts? And so before I continue, just a couple of concepts to define. The arts, although it's a really broad term, I narrowed this down to just a few for the purposes of this study. So I included theater, music, dance, writing, and creative arts therapy, which is a combination of one or more of the arts that's generally tailored to the patient. And the domains of learning is a concept that I used to framework my research so that I could understand the results of the studies a little bit better. So there are 3 domains of learning. One is psychomotor, which is physical skill learning. So you can learn how to do a dance step, or you can learn how to do a physical exercise. Another domain of learning is the affective domain, and that talks about emotions and mood regulation. And the third domain of learning is cognitive, and that refers to mental skills like problem solving and memory. So next, how I researched this, what were my research methods? I ended up going with a scoping review to study this research question. And if you're not familiar, a scoping review is essentially a broader systematic review. So a scoping review seeks to clarify key concepts or definitions in the literature, and it might identify and analyze some knowledge gaps. So as you can see from this bottom article title, it's a great example of a scoping review. So it has mindfulness interventions in physical rehabilitation. So you can tell that this is quite broad. Mindfulness interventions is quite a broad and general term. So you can expect that this article will go into the details of what mindfulness interventions are and how they impact physical rehabilitation. Whereas this top article is a great example of a systematic review because it's very specific to Alzheimer's disease and older adults. So a scoping review fit my question, and so that's why I used that in my research. So after choosing the scoping review, I developed a search strategy to apply to different electronic databases to start to gather some studies for analysis. So I used some of the electronic databases like PubMed and Siena, as you can see here. And then as I started to gather studies, I had to develop some inclusion and exclusion criteria to make sure that all the studies I was gathering really fit and were tailored to my research question. So just to highlight one of these here that was really important was in the inclusion criteria, all of the studies that I found had to have at least psychomotor or those physical skill-based outcome measures because we wanted it to be related to physical therapy, and physical therapy uses those physical skill-based learning techniques. So the studies could also have affective or those emotional outcome measures and or cognitive. And I'll just give you another brief second to look over the other inclusion and exclusion criteria. Okay, and so once we gathered, applied the search strategy, we started with 1,144 studies. And then after applying the inclusion and exclusion criteria, we ended with 76 studies for analysis. And so to analyze all these studies, we put them in a large chart in an Excel sheet. And then we started adding information from each study that was relevant to analyze. So again, just to highlight a couple of these, we looked at the art modality used in the study, the patient population that was studied, who administered the study, whether that was a physical therapist or an art expert or someone who was both. We looked at what outcome measures were used and whether or not there was a treatment effect. So that means whether or not the arts did make a significant difference in practice. And so the results, what did we find when we looked at all 76 of those articles? We actually found that there were enhanced outcomes for both the physical and emotional learning domains, and also to a lesser extent, the cognitive as well. So to zoom in on these results, for the physical skill, 38 studies that had only physical skill outcome measures, and 36 of those had a treatment effect, which is a really exciting discovery. The most common art modalities used in these studies were dance and music, and the patient populations were really broad. They ranged from neurological and genetic conditions to chronic lung disease, chronic pain, and osteoarthritis. Very similarly, studies that had emotional outcome measures and those physical outcome measures were 29, and 27 of those had a treatment effect. The most common art modalities, again, were dance followed by music, and the patient populations, again, ranged very broadly from neurological conditions to mental illness, cystic fibrosis, and orthopedic conditions. And you can really see here the cognitive was quite different. We only had 2 studies that had cognitive outcome measures and physical outcome measures. And that's likely due to the fact that we had that constraint that all the studies had to have physical outcome measures. But both of these studies that we found had a treatment effect. The art modalities used were dance and music, and these patient populations were necessarily narrowed to healthy adults and Parkinson's disease because there were so few studies. And then we actually found 7 that had outcome measures in all 3 domains of learning, and 6 of those had a treatment effect, which is again really exciting finding. The most common art modality was dance, followed by creative arts therapy. And these patient populations were narrowed to neurological conditions, different neurological conditions. And so this pie chart is a great appreciation for what all this looks like. So you can see in blue represents studies that had those psychomotor or physical skill outcome measures. In red are ones that had the emotional and affective domain, and then the remaining dealt with the cognitive domain. And green, you can see all of the outcome measures for each of the domains. This pie chart is another great way to visualize what the breakdown of the arts, and you can really appreciate here how with orange being dance and yellow being music therapy, you can really appreciate that those were the majority of the arts used. And so at this point, you might be wondering, what does it look like to include the arts in physical therapy practice? I have some images here that are pulled from different videos, and in lieu of time, I'll just describe what these videos were talking about. The first image on the left shows a physical therapist who is really passionate about using music and dance in her practice. And so she describes how music is really great for encouraging and motivating movement. And throughout the video, you could see how engaged her patients were throughout the session, and just their lightened mood throughout, the physical activity that the therapist was taking them through. In the second image on the right, you can see an art professional who is leading a class in ballet. And she was inspired to start a project where she includes ballet and rehabilitation from her own injury and recovery. And she found that a lot of the ballet moves correlate or overlap with some of the exercises already prescribed from physical therapy. So she uses that in her work. And then this third example is a great way that physical therapists can co-treat with an art expert. So in here you can see two music therapists working with a physical therapist. And in this scenario, the physical therapist might say something like, "Can you tap your foot?" And the music therapist would turn that into a song with the lyrics, "Tap your foot." And this really helps the patient stay engaged and motivated during a skill that's a little bit more difficult for them, especially with difficulty with balance or maybe even having pain doing those dance moves. So it helps them to move through that pain and to enhance movement. So you also might be wondering, why is it that the arts are so impactful, and why can they enhance physical therapy practice? Well, the first reason might be emotional inspiration. The arts can provide a means by which we can move past emotional constraints. And inspiration, interestingly, has been described as an integrative mental function that kind of connects all three of these different learning domains: the cognitive side, emotional side, and the goal-directed function. The arts also tap into the limbic system of our brains, and the limbic system is involved in emotional desires, motivational rewards, and the appreciation of aesthetic value. So the arts can help motivate us to do things that are a little bit difficult. And this motivation also plays a role in accelerated skill acquisition. There are several studies that show that motivation can help us acquire skills more quickly. And so that's important when you're trying to recover loss of movement or learn a new movement skill. And so some conclusions about what does this research mean for moving forward. First of all, we found substantial evidence that there is a significant enhancement to physical therapy practice when the arts are involved. And so that really shows that collaboration and integration between these two fields should continue. We also found that broad populations are impacted by the use of the arts, and this occurs across multiple domains of learning. There also are some implications for education that perhaps this should be included in the education of physical therapy students and other physical therapy professionals so that they can use this kind of information and the arts in their own practice to enhance patient care. This research also may provide possible solutions to compliance issues with physical therapy, homework for patients, and because the arts can be a motivating way to, gain movement. And it also may provide an avenue for supporting the mental health of patients, since it does tap into that affective or mood-based domain as well. And future research could look more into the cognitive domain and how the arts might impact mental learning process. And a meta-analysis could be done on this research to better understand how physical therapy practice is impacted by the arts. So thank you all for listening. And of course, this project would not have been possible without my faculty mentors and support from my university. So thank you all again for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Emma. We're going to do a quick screen grab. So everybody smile real quick and we'll do that. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay, great. Thank you. And there was one question in the chat here. Emma, is the age of the patients a significant factor in the efficacy of arts therapy, or do the benefits extend across a large age range?
I would say they extend across a large age range. We saw some studies that were actually on preterm infants and then some with the elderly. So I think they definitely apply to a large range of ages.
I like that image of the older folks doing the ballet, and the women are all on one side and they're kind of getting it, and the older men are on the other side kind of not getting it. It was very cute to see that. Any other questions for any of our outstanding presenters this morning? Just curious, what are all your majors, our presenters this morning?
I'm medical lab science.
Medical lab science, okay.
My major is chemistry.
Chemistry.
Bio.
Bio.
Mine is exercise science and bio.
And I'm a physical therapy major.
Okay. And are you thinking, Emma, of integrating this kind of the arts and physical therapy and, you know, when you start practicing?
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, definitely a goal of mine.
Yeah. Well, I thought your presentations all were really outstanding and so timely with everything going on in the world. One more question here in the chat. What did you learn in general about research from these efforts? Anyone want to comment on that?
Well, I learned that I can combine what I love. Like I want to be a doctor one day, but I like that I can apply research to what I'm going to be doing in my future. So I think that's awesome. Like that's what I want to do. I want to do applied research. So it's really cool to me.
Great. Well, I think we are just out of time here. Thank you again to all of our presenters. You ladies did a fantastic job this morning. And I hope that I will see all of you in other sessions this morning and into the rest of the day, because we have a lot of wonderful events planned. So thank you and congratulations again. You guys did a great job. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.